Okay, this is a brief, I'll try to be brief, discussion of the concept of quality, and it is taken from a book we use in Comparative Education 555 by Kubaugh and Fossum regarding a framework by Harvey, and I'll go over that. The reason I wanted to introduce this was to give you kind of a broad framework to think about as you're reading the Triumph of the Bricks, because this talks about the goals and ideals of the state. In the text that in the Triumph of the Bricks, they talk about a theory that the state influences education, obviously, for particular reasons, and they go into that in detail, and this just gives you another framework to think about that. So one of the issues about quality of education is that when a state or its publics think about what good education is or what education is for, the ends and means of education, they are basing that on a implied definition of quality. As Paulo Freire says, precisely because there isn't a substantive quality whose profile you can find universally produced and available, we must think about the concept and determine the nature of the quality we are talking about. And the nature of the quality we are talking about differs from one context to the next. The reason this is important is because educational policy is a series of compromises about these implicit definitions of quality that are often not made explicit in educational discourses. They're occasionally made more explicit in political discourses, which is why you'll hear different political parties arguing for different visions of education or different visions of educational reform. But a lot of the ideologies that are driving those visions are somewhat hidden. But the ends and means of education, as understood by the state and its public, influence the implicit and explicit goals for schooling and higher education at lots of levels. And I would argue that this particular discussion of quality is introduced relative to mostly K-12 educational policy, but you can't separate the goals of K-12 educational policy from the goals of higher education. They're directly influenced because of the pipeline effect. Okay, so Harvey's framework, he was trying to identify different conceptions of educational quality as they are used in educational policy and educational reform movements. The first, educational quality as exceptionality, and I'm taking this directly from the definitions provided by Kubaugh and Fossum, and I do not know how to say those names, so mumble if you have to use them in public until we find out how they are pronounced. But educational quality as exceptionality refers to schooling that upholds a gold standard and promotes the pursuit of educational excellence in terms of the strengths of the school or the system relative to others. So this is a competitive model, and students are placed in competitive relationships to each other. Schools are placed in competitive relationships with each other. And I think in the Bricks text, you'll see when they talk about the drive for world-class universities, that might be thought of in this model. Education as consistency refers to schooling that provides equivalent educational experiences for all students. The idea that all students should receive the same quality of education, the same experiences. Educational quality as fitness for purpose refers to schooling that refines participants' abilities in targeted roles. And we'll see this in the case of Soviet education in Russia and in the historically in China, where schooling was specifically designed to train individuals for their place in the socialist society. Educational quality as value for money is one that gets pushed aside in the subsequent discussion, but it clearly is going to influence policy through the arguments for school accountability, what is the education that you're receiving worth? And this is something they talk about a lot in the thesis of the Brick Book, in terms of the ways that the value of education is a public perception and how the state manipulates that public perception. Educational quality as transformative potential is probably the closest to a Freirean notion that education can change a person and can change a society if done right. It's schooling that propels change and enables movement towards different futures seen as desirable. So there's a presumption that the current situation is not desirable and that there is a typically more equitable future that needs to be striven for. So these are obviously positions that are in conflict, because you can't have consistency education the same for everyone at the same time that you have exceptionality education as a competitive venture. So the Harvey, they have this chart, and take a while, pause this if you need to read it through carefully. But it lays out how these different conceptions of educational quality are aligned with each other or in direct conflict with each other. So you can see where exceptionality, the goal is for excellence, to try to create a culture of excellence. Consistency is for a culture of equality. Fitness for purpose is looking for a refinement and perfection of a system that perfectly aligns education to typically a labor market outcome. And equality as its transformative potential is looking for social and personal change. So you can see down at the bottom, and there's some examples here, and it gives you the language. Well, first I would say, if you're thinking about American education, you may see kind of examples of all four of these operating at the same time, with a pretty strong emphasis on exceptionality and consistency, and how the two of those are in a constant tension in our school system. Education for social change is alluded to, but not typically made manifest in our educational policies. So then down at the bottom, you see where these tensions come out. The exceptionality conflicts directly with consistency, and is somewhat in harmony with fitness for purpose. You can see this in American education, where we have a competitive climate for students within schools and in some ways between schools. But at the same time, in those same schools, we also have vocational tracks which are more closely aligned with career and workplace readiness, as well as college prep. So the idea of tracking is fitness for purpose, but at the same time we have this competitive atmosphere. Consistency, again, conflicts directly with exceptionality. The compromises that are required if you're going to try to do both, they argue, can dilute policy and practice. And so what wins out is more of the local values. And we see this in different school districts across the United States, where you would have more emphasis on one or the other coming out at the local level. As fitness for purpose conflicts with differentiation, the idea that that you have a hierarchy, but it also forecloses flexibility and social mobility. So it conflicts very much with transformative potential, because if you're foreclosing people's opportunities, then you're definitely not offering them a different future. And likewise, transformative potential conflicts with fitness for purpose and exceptionality. It also has a strong bias to reject incremental change, which we'll see. So Cabal and Fossum lay this out as two sets of direct conflicts and talk about them that way. First, the last one I was just talking about, fitness for purpose. This view predisposes it to favor refinements of present circumstances and not really to look for futures. So it takes the current labor market and fits educational processes to feed into that current labor market or current societal needs. This is strongly emphasized by human capital theory, which most of you should be aware of. If you took sociology of ed, you're definitely aware of it. And human capital theory refers, of course, to the idea that education can increase the capital of the person being educated and therefore increases the economic potential of that individual and thus raising the economic potential of society. Sorry, Nick, I know you could do a better job of describing that. Another theory that comes up with this is the correspondence principle or social reproduction theory by Bowles and Gintis. And they talk specifically about the way that social relationships in schools mimic the hierarchical organizations of the workplaces. The idea that students in a traditional school setting are trained almost like factory workers to follow rules and to meet expectations as laid out by the school system. And the idea that schooling prepares students for the social roles that they will take on as workers in a hierarchical fashion because different jobs are perceived as being higher and lower in value. Transformation, on the other hand, has a bias towards change and looking for potential futures that are different from the situation today. And this is strongly influenced by critical theory, looking at power relations and recognizing power relations in society and how they serve to marginalize, exclude, and otherwise create inequalities, and that the only way to overcome those inequalities is to recognize those power differentials and to change them through the transformative potential, in this case, of education, or in other social settings, it would be more kind of revolutionary thinking. Okay, the other conflict that they lay out is the conflict between exceptionality and consistency. Obviously, exceptionality requires educational differentiation. You have to have winners and losers. And this would be inconsistent with the idea that all students are winners. So we hear this in the No Child Left Behind rhetoric of consistency, but at the same time we have a strong push in our schools for making sure that the students who are on top get supposedly by merit, but we know that merit is influenced by social inequalities, that through a merit system, the best and the brightest will go to the top. This also is influenced by the divisions between academic and vocational education. Jessica, you should be sitting up at this point. And the idea that an academic education is a higher status than a vocational education, and that there are higher status, more professional jobs, and lower status, more labor-driven jobs. And that, of course, also reflects social stratification in society. So when you have a socially stratified society, you're more likely to find ideologies of exceptionality being publicly acceptable. Consistency, on the other hand, refers to an equalization of opportunity and a leveling of educational experience, where a system that would create winners and losers would be seen as something that is also creating unequal educational experiences. This was strongly emphasized during the Civil Rights Movement, of course, where the idea that we should have equality of access to education, equality of educational experiences during the educational time, and then also equality of educational outcomes. So all students should have equal access experience and have the potential of equal outcomes. And so school systems, like in the US, are set up to try to create that. But that is, of course, inimical to exceptionality because of that's it's talking about a system that would have consistent results, and that, of course, doesn't work for exceptionality. Um, and it reflects democratic goals of education as a public good, um, which we've talked about before. So the compromises that you see in this, when a state chooses one definition over another, they are embracing certain goals. Like in Russia, for example, they embrace the goal of fitness for purpose, and certain other goals are rejected or cast aside. The transformational capacity of education to change the system in the Soviet system, for example, was set aside or rejected as being against the aims of the state. Each of these conceptions of qualities has a reasonable rationale, and educational policymakers and politicians use those justifications for certain kinds of educational change and reform movements. None of the conceptions is inherently right or wrong. We may, as for those of us who have grown up in an American system, we may see one as more desirable because it's reflecting the ideology that we have been exposed to. But so the important part is not that it's right or wrong, but to recognize the discourses regarding these compromises. When we look at educational systems in different countries, we should try to see what kinds of educational quality are being celebrated, and what kinds of educational quality are being rejected, and what kind of compromises are being made, even if those compromises are not made explicit.